This video will cover the next two principles of layout on our list: size, scale, emphasis, and then contrast. Now, size, scale, emphasis is a form of contrast, which is why I've grouped these two principles together. Contrast as a whole is one of the most effective communication techniques because it creates interest. In other words, contrast creates emphasis and focus. It helps you lead the viewer's eye in the way you want to lead it, which, as you know, is one of the most important jobs we have as visual communicators. We're going to start off by talking about size, scale, and emphasis. I think most of us, when we think about size and scale relating to visual emphasis, immediately go to bigger is better. We perceive that bigger conveys more importance, and that can certainly be true. For instance, my favorite fine dining establishment. Is there anything more impressive than a 30-foot tall donut?
No way!
I think not. If only there was a 40-foot tall cup of coffee to go with it.
Yum!
But what if every building on the street had a giant donut on their roof? All of a sudden, that impressive scale would not be as impressive, would it?
I don't know.
Because all of a sudden, that donut wouldn't be unique. It wouldn't stand out as a one-of-a-kind element. So maybe in that case, using something very small would actually create more impact and visual focus. And since focus equates to emphasis, all of a sudden, smaller is better. A bit counterintuitive, I know, but using difference in size and scale to create emphasis is a very powerful communication tool, big or small. Okay, so let's move on to other types of contrast. What are people going to pay attention to most immediately? Well, chances are it's the thing that is different. If an early cave person walked out of their cave in the morning, stretching to greet the day, and they saw something orange in the green jungle, chances are they are going to scream in terror, because that orange thing can eat them. We as people are hardwired to notice that which doesn't fit the norm. Our very survival depends on it. We as communicators can take advantage of that. Contrasting elements stand out by virtue of their uniqueness relative to what is around them, like an orange tiger in a green jungle. What do you see here? Well, chances are, since all of these elements are the same, you're going to see the group first. You're not going to focus on a particular single element. We'll talk more about this idea in the next video on Gestalt. But once you get past that group, once you decide to look a little bit more closely, chances are you're going to go to the circle on the left first and then work your way across. That's the way we as Westerners are indoctrinated to absorb information. So what do you focus on now? Well, I'd be shocked if it wasn't that big circle because it's different. And it might eat us. If you're doing your job as a communicator, then you take advantage of that instinct. You need to create those differences that focus attention. The contrast used here is obviously large versus small, very similar to the size scale emphasis that we talked about earlier. Here are a few others. Thin versus wide, short versus tall, white versus black, and color versus monochrome. There are tons of others. In fact, a really good exercise, and you may even want to stop the video and do it now, is to sit down with pencil and paper and write down all the different types of contrast you can think of. Now, contrast is really just another way of saying opposites, or things that are very different from each other. So what are all the things you can think of that are contrasting to each other? And this list you create, every single thing on it is going to be gold. Why? Because contrast helps you control what the viewer sees and when and how they see it, giving you the power to control how the message is delivered and perceived. So let's look at this in a little different way. Here are two elements. Which one of these do you think is more important? Where does your attention go first? How about now? And then here, where do you focus first in this layout? So this brings up an important point. If you take any element by itself, in isolation, you can find interest. It's the only thing there is to look at. There's no visual competition, so you can easily view and appreciate everything about that element.
You're cute.
But if you have more than a single element, then you have to deal with context. In other words, how does the element you want to focus on relate to the elements around it? Context is just another word for environment here. So what is the environment that the element is in? And how are you going to differentiate that element from everything else? Here's another way of looking at this idea. Here's just a single boot, and I think this single boot is beautiful. I mean, it's old, it's beat up, it's got a beautiful texture and color, and a story. The layout makes it incredibly easy for me to focus on the boot and get into these details. The contrast of that single dark boot in that large white negative space is powerful. It delivers a very specific and direct message. Well, if one boot is good, then a whole bunch of boots is going to be better, right? Not so much. Whereas before it was easy for me to get in and look at the boot, now it's the same as what we had with that row of circles. I see the group, that's what I notice first, and then I actually have to do some work, put some effort into going in and understanding each of the individual elements, because the layout isn't giving me any visual direction. But if I change just one thing, look what happens. All of a sudden we've got contrast again. We've got contrast of a group relative to a single element. We've got contrast of elegant to rugged, smooth to rough. We've got a contrast of scale. Small, delicate ballet slipper next to big, dusty boots. All of these contrasts are dictating that the ballet slipper stands out. It is the first thing the viewer will see. It's at the top of the visual hierarchy, which gives it the most importance. Now what if I switch this around? Same thing, right? Right! But a very different message. Which leads me to a very important conclusion. 3 of these 4 layouts are using contrast to great effect. But each also gives the viewer a very different message, depending on which element has been given emphasis. So it boils down to this. When you use contrast to create focus and emphasis, make sure you get it right.